Welcome everyone to August the 10th. Today is the 231st anniversary of the capture of Louis XVI, the last of the kings of France, by the French revolutionaries. As usual, once more, it was a woman's fault. It was her own wife and queen, Marie Antoinette, who asked for help to her brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II. Once his brother sent some troops inside of France trying to rescue the royal family, the peasants kind of took it the wrong way and kind of barged in the royal palace and kind of put Louis XVI on a guillotine and cut his head off. So, yes, indeed, it was her fault. Now, for today, talking about revolutions, a bit less bloody than French ones, we have the talk about the reworks, the changes and the introductions of new or reworked specs in WoW. Because we have entered a situation where we can start to kind of see a pattern. Because right now, for example, we have in-game a newly, freshly reworked set of specs. At the moment, we have Arcane, Frost and Fire for mages, as well as Holy Paladin for Paladin. These specs have been reworked in 10.1.5. Now, what is the judgment? What is the assessment of these specs? Well, at the moment, the assessment is that they are kind of OP. Especially Fire Mage is super strong in both the Raid and Mythic Plus. Don't get fooled by Fire Mage being the top dog. Frost Mage is also very powerful. And then Arcane Mage is the lower one. In Mythic Plus, not nearly as much. They can still carry, they can still pull up their own in the Raid. It's definitely not a weak spec by any means. And especially what might be more important to many players, if we asked mage players if they enjoy, if they like more the older version of the spec compared to the new one, I would say, you know, an estimate of 95% of the mage players are pretty happy with the way the specs play now. So beyond complaining about the specs being OP, we can all agree that these reworks have improved the mage specs. Then we have more or less the same discussion for Paladin. Most players would agree that the Paladin spec, the Holy Paladin being reworked, have improved the way Holy Paladin plays across the board, on top of course, being at the moment very powerful. But the patch didn't just rework a few of the already existing specs, it also introduced a brand new one. It introduced augmentation. Also, right off the bat, augmentation has been very powerful. So up to this point, everything new that came recently has been super powerful. Now, if we start going backwards a little bit, we can also find, for example, the rework to Retribution Paladin. Well, once more, Retribution Paladin rework was very well received. The spec jumped up in power significantly. At the moment, Red Paladin is the most popular of the melee specs in both PvE activities, whether it is the Raid or Mythic Plus. Red Paladin is the most played. The performance is also okay, definitely not on the super OP level, but we can say much stronger than they were before. So up to this point we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different specs being reworked or added into the game, and they have been a glaring success. At the start of this expansion we have gotten the 50th rework of Shadow Priest, for example, and then they received the 51st rework of Shadow Priest in the later 10.1 patch, and that also became very successful. Not to mention the brand new class introduced in the game. We got Season 1 at release, and Preservation Evoker was super powerful, as well as a pretty, entertaining spec to play. And then Season 2 also introduced Devastation Evoker, which after a few buffs also became an S tier spec in the raid and a decent, second strongest beyond the first tier of the best specs in Mythic Plus. So we are now at a point where if you consider, Frost, Fire, Arcane, Holy Paladin, Red Paladin, Augmentation, Devastation, Preservation Evoker, we have like 8 either new or reworked specs which have gotten to be, either meta or flavor of the month or very popular, as well as simultaneously being quite enjoyable and praised by the community for being good additions to the game or good changes to the game. Now, I know what you might say. way, this is classic of Blizzard. Of course, when a new thing gets introduced, Blizzard wants them to be OP because they want the spec, the change that they did, to be played. They want a lot of data, a lot of info, a lot of feedback on what was changed. This is not fully true because, for example, we have gotten the rework from ranged to melee of survival, and that was a disaster. It was definitely not a good change or a good addition, etc., etc. So that wasn't really a successful one. In the same expansion, in Legion, we also got the addition of Demon Hunter. While Havoc became a good enough, a strong enough spec in Mythic Plus in particular, Vengeance definitely didn't. Vengeance took a long time to even become relevant in any activity. It wasn't that much of a powerful pick for a long time. We also had previously many of the last reworks of Shadow Priest, which didn't really end up anywhere. Shadow Priest was very rarely one of the stronger picks in Mythic Plus, as well as not as popular in the raid in multiple iterations of their versions, their builds. We can even go further back, back when you guys were in elementary school, specs and classes like Monk, right? At the release of Mists of Pandaria, Windwalker wasn't strong at all, Brewmaster also was barely even played. The only OP spec, hilariously enough, was Mistweaver. And even then, it was nerfed quite quickly after being quite OP on release. So in previous expansions and in previous patches, we did have new releases, new additions, new reworks, but they were more hit and miss. Some of the specs were released in a pretty poor state, they didn't really get to be very popular or very powerful, but since the release of Dragonflight, we seemingly have gotten a strike after strike after strike of specs being changed in any way and suddenly spiking up to the top and becoming very, very powerful. This is relevant because, number one, in 10.2, which should be at this point roughly a couple of months away, we get 3 more specs being reworked. We get the rogue specs. So, following the pattern of this expansion, we can assume that at least a couple of these specs will become broken OP, super flavor of the month, etc., etc. And that's kind of the whole point of today's video. The power that Blizzard is giving to all of these reworked specs that seem to just fly all the way to the top of the performance and at the same time of the popularity after they get changed by Blizzard. I'm saying the point because at the end of the day, if you rework, 5, maybe 6 specs every expansion, we have 38 specs in the game. This is going to take you some 5 to 6 expansions before you actually are done reworking all of them. If we are moving in a direction where every time we get a new rework, those specs immediately and automatically become one of the stronger ones, it kind of becomes an issue for the rest of the player base, of course, for the rest of the specs, the rest of the options in the game. Especially if you rework the specs with a modern take in mind, with thinking about what they can bring into the raid. So you go and give rogues atrophic poison, so effectively you give them a guaranteed spot in the raid just because of that ability. Or maybe you rework paladins and you give them retribution aura, effectively giving them another guaranteed spot in the raid because of that. Or you rework mages who already have things to give to your party or your raid, for example time warp, bloodlust, or for example something like arcane intellect buff, and then on top of that you give them, for example, mass barrier. You increase the survivability of the specs, like Red Paladin or Holy Paladin after the changes to their talents have become much more sturdy, much more tanky than before, which makes them stronger in multiple activities, and those go to impact the power of the specs. What about the older specs that have been left behind without a rework, like for example Hunter, one of the squishier specs right now? How iconic and ironic at the same time is it to have a spec called Survival and still be quite a squishy spec? You would have expected a spec with that namesake to be a little bit more tanky, a little bit more resilient to damage, and they are not whatsoever. So there is this kind of fear, or perhaps worry, that the more Blizzard keeps reworking and changing and updating all of these specs, as soon as they get updated, they will be updated with a modern take of the class. So they will be given more mobility, more utility, more defensives, perhaps more mandatory raid buffs, which will progressively leave further and further behind all of the specs or all of the classes that do not receive this type of treatment. That is somewhat the worry with this shower of reworks and updates we are receiving. It is good, as we pointed out as we went over the list of changed specs, that after we look at Arcane, Fire, Frost, Holy Paladin, Red Paladin, even Prot Paladin, the new 3 Evoker specs, that all of those changes have basically been positive. They have been well received by the community. The specs are playing better than they were before, you know, they are more entertaining to play, but at the same time Blizzard is somewhat releasing them and updating them in a kind of overloaded set of abilities, whether it is in terms of utility, in terms of defensives, in terms of damage or healing profile, which is going to make it a little bit harder and a little bit more problematic for every other spec and class that does not receive this type of change. Imagine if we already know rogues are getting the rework in 10.2 and then Blizzard announces that in 10.3 we have Fury and Arms Warrior reworks. You know, now you know that for this entire expansion, Hunters won't be getting anything, that Resto Shaman, Elemental Shaman, Frost, Unholy, Windwalker Monk won't get anything. And will we have to assume, perhaps likely, that these rework specs will immediately shoot up to become meta because of how Blizzard have been changing and updating all of the specs? That's why I hope that if Blizzard continues this route of updating and reworking different specs, they still keep in mind that these specs have to be playing with other specs, with the rest of the specs that are not being changed. Because if the rogue rework comes and they get an extra mandatory raid buff given to them, and then they reduce the cooldown of Shroud to be 1 minute, and then they give them a 15% AoE damage reduction buff to give to their party, and then they add a 15-second cooldown blind, this, you know, is going to impact and is going to hurt all of the other specs which are stuck in like 2015 of balancing, of tuning. That's the hope I have for the future reworks and updates. So, with this debate for today about the reworks that have been happening in Dragonflight so far, we can stop for today. With this out of the way, we can start by saying our goodbyes to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. Help which can still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below on this very video, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, do you ever wonder when you're done doing something that took 30 minutes and then you look at the clock and you woke up 4 hours ago? What have I been doing for the rest of the time? Huh? 4 hours?